While every rancher in the valley was racing to finish walls and roofs before the snow came, Jesse Calhoun was digging a hole that went nowhere. The 28-year-old widow had spent 3 weeks excavating a trench 3 feet deep around the entire perimeter of her cabin foundation. A ditch that connected to nothing, drained nothing, and served no purpose anyone could identify. "The Calhoun woman has lost her mind," announced Garrett Hutchins at the feed store, loud enough for everyone to hear. Digging her own moat like some kind of medieval fool. Probably the grief finally caught up with her. But Jessie wasn't building a moat. And if you want to find out why her horses stood on warm stable floors while her neighbor's livestock froze to the ground, stay with me. Jessie Calhoun had arrived in the Montana Territory in the spring of 1879, a bride of 19 following her husband Thomas to a homestead he'd claimed sight unseen. She'd left behind a comfortable life in Pennsylvania, her father's successful farm, her mother's warm kitchen, everything familiar and safe, for the promise of land that would be theirs alone. The first 3 years had been hard but good. Thomas was a skilled carpenter, and together they'd built a solid cabin, a small barn, corrals for the horses they planned to breed. Jessie discovered she had a gift for working with animals, a calm patience that earned trust from even the most skittish colts. By 1882, they had a small but growing herd and a reputation for quality horses. Then Thomas died. It was a stupid accident. A fall from a half-broken Mustang, a kick to the head, and suddenly Jessie was alone with a ranch she couldn't run by herself and neighbors, who assumed she'd sell out and go back east where she belonged. She didn't sell. She hired a hand for the heavy work, learned to do 3 people's labor herself, and kept the ranch running through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. The neighbors stopped expecting her to leave, but they never stopped waiting for her to fail. Now, 5 years after Thomas's death, Jessie had 8 good horses, a solid cabin, and a plan that everyone in the valley thought proved she'd finally cracked. She was going to dig a ditch around her house and fill it with straw. The idea had come from her grandmother. Jessie's grandmother had emigrated from Germany as a girl, bringing with her the old country knowledge that had been passed down through generations of harsh winters. One technique she described was the warm graben, a warm trench dug around root cellars to keep stored vegetables from freezing. The cold travels through the ground like water through a creek, her grandmother had explained, her accent thick even after 50 years in America. But it cannot travel through air, cannot travel through straw. You make a wall the cold cannot cross, and everything inside stays warm. Jessie had remembered this during her first Montana winter, when the cold had nearly killed her. The cabin Thomas had built was solid. Good logs, tight chinking, a stone fireplace that drew well. But the floor was a nightmare. By December, the packed earth beneath the floorboards had frozen solid, and the cold radiated upward with a relentless hunger that no amount of firewood could satisfy. Jessie had slept in her boots for 3 months, her feet still aching with cold every morning. Her dog, a shaggy gray creature named Smoke, had developed frostbite on his paws from sleeping too close to the frozen floor. The second winter was worse. The third was the year Thomas died, and Jessie had been too consumed with grief and survival to think about improvements. The 4th and 5th winters she'd endured through pure stubbornness, burning twice the firewood of any sensible person, wearing wool socks to bed, accepting frozen floors as the price of Montana life. But this year would be different. This year, she was going to try her grandmother's trick. If it worked for root cellars, it might work for cabins. And if it worked for cabins, it might work for stables. She started digging in early September when the ground was still soft from summer. The trench measured 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, running in a complete rectangle around the cabin foundation with no gaps and no drainage outlet. Jessie dug alone, working from first light until her shoulders screamed, carving through rocky Montana soil that fought her every inch. Her nearest neighbor, Garrett Hutchins, noticed the excavation on the fourth day. He'd settled the adjacent property 8 years ago and considered himself the authority on everything related to ranching in the valley. He rode over with the expression of amused concern. "Jesse, what in God's name are you digging there?" Jessie straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead. She'd hoped to avoid this conversation until the work was done, but Garrett Hutchins was not a man who could resist offering his opinion. "Thermal trench," she said. "Going to fill it with straw and dry grass. Creates a barrier that stops the frost from reaching the ground under my cabin." Garrett stared at her. "You're digging a ditch to keep the ground from freezing." "That's right. And you're going to fill it with straw." "Straw, leaves, dry grass, anything that traps air and blocks the cold from traveling through the soil." Garrett removed his hat and scratched his head with the theatrical slowness of a man preparing to deliver wisdom to a fool. "Jesse, the ground here freezes 4 feet deep. 4 feet! Your little trench won't stop that. The frost will go right under it and come up through your floor, same as always." "Frost travels through soil," Jessie said, keeping her voice level. "Not through air, not through dry straw. The trench creates a break. Cold can't cross what it can't touch. That's not how it works." "It is. Actually, my grandmother used this technique in Pennsylvania, in Germany before that. This is in Pennsylvania." Garrett's voice had taken on the patronizing tone she'd grown to hate over 5 years of widowhood. "This isn't Germany. This is Montana territory. The winters here are different. Cold is cold. Physics is physics." Garrett shook his head slowly, the way he might shake it at a child who'd said something foolish. "I've watched a lot of greenhorns try strange things out here. Most of them are gone by spring. You're wasting weeks of labor before winter. Time you should be spending on firewood, on feed, on anything useful. I appreciate your concern. Do you? Because it seems like you're determined to freeze to death trying to prove some old German folk wisdom works in country your grandmother never saw." Jessie picked up her shovel. "I guess we'll find out in January." Word spread quickly through the valley's 7 homesteads. The Calhoun widow was digging a moat. The Calhoun widow thought she could stop the ground from freezing. The Calhoun widow was going to kill herself and her animals with foreign foolishness. At the feed store in Miller's Crossing, ranchers gathered around the stove and shared their assessments. Old Pete Morrison, who'd been in the valley since before the war, declared that the trench would fill with snowmelt, freeze solid, and make the problem twice as bad. Margaret Hutchins, Garrett's wife, organized a delegation of women to visit Jessie and talk sense into her. "We're worried about you," Margaret announced, standing in Jessie's yard while the widow continued digging. "Winter's coming, and you're wasting time on whatever this is. Your horses need care. Your cabin needs firewood stacked. This ditch isn't going to help anyone." Jessie kept digging. "My horses are fine. My firewood is stacked. And this ditch is going to keep my floor from freezing." "Jessie, please. Thomas wouldn't have wanted. Thomas would have helped me dig." Jessie drove her shovel into the earth with unnecessary force. "Thomas listened when I had ideas. Thomas didn't assume I was stupid just because I'm a woman." Margaret's face went red. "Well, I can see you're determined to learn the hard way. Don't come crying to us in February when your foolishness gets your animals killed. I won't." The women retreated, offended. Jessie kept digging. Smoke sat at the edge of the trench, watching her work with the patient attention of a dog who had learned that his human usually knew what she was doing. His gray coat was thick with the early growth of his winter fur, and his amber eyes caught the September sunlight. "They think I'm crazy," Jessie told him. "Maybe I am, but I'm tired of frozen floors, Smoke. I'm tired of sleeping in my boots and watching you limp on frostbitten paws. If there's even a chance this works, it's worth looking like a fool." The dog wagged his tail once, as if in agreement. By October 1st, the trench was complete, 3 feet deep, 2 feet wide, forming a continuous rectangle around the cabin's foundation. Jessie had also dug a smaller trench around the stable. If this worked for her, she wanted it to work for her horses too. The filling took another week. She used straw from her own hay stores, dried leaves she'd collected through September, grass she'd cut and dried on the cabin roof. She layered the materials carefully, the way her grandmother had described, loose at the bottom for air pockets, more compressed toward the top, finished with a cap of soil to protect the fill from moisture. When she was done, the trenches were invisible, just strips of slightly raised earth surrounding her buildings. No one who didn't know what to look for would ever notice them. Garrett Hutchins rode by as she was finishing the stable trench. He sat on his horse for a long moment, looking at her work, then shook his head and rode away without a word. Jessie watched him go, then went inside to prepare for winter. The cold came early that year. By November 1st, the temperature had dropped below freezing and showed no intention of rising. By November 15th, the first real snow had fallen, 2 feet in a single night, transforming the valley into a white wilderness. By December 1st, the thermometer outside Jessie's window read 5 below zero, and her floor was warm. Not hot. Nothing like summer, but warm in a way she'd never experienced in 6 Montana winters. She could walk across it in her stocking feet without pain. She could sit on the boards to put on her boots and not feel the cold seeping through her clothes. Smoke slept sprawled in the middle of the cabin, his belly pressed to wood that held no threat. The ground beneath her feet had not frozen. Jessie checked it herself, using a long iron rod she'd heated in the fire. She pushed the rod through a gap between the floorboards and into the earth below. It slid through easily, no resistance, no impact against frozen soil. The ground was cold, certainly, perhaps 40 degrees, but it was not the solid mass of ice that she remembered from previous winters. The trench was working. She checked the stable next and found the same miracle. Her horses stood on floors that gave back no killing cold, their hooves comfortable, their legs warm. They had stopped the constant shifting and stamping that she now realized had been their attempt to keep circulation flowing against the frozen ground. "It works," she whispered to Smoke, kneeling on her cabin floor with her palm pressed flat against the boards. "It actually works." The dog looked at her with what might have been an "I told you so" expression, then went back to sleep. January was brutal. The temperature dropped to 30 below on the coldest nights, with wind chills that stripped flesh from bone in minutes. Snow piled against buildings in drifts that reached the roof lines. The valley became a frozen wasteland where survival was measured in hours, not days. Jessie stayed inside with her animals, burning firewood at a rate that should have depleted her supply, but somehow didn't. The warm floor, she'd started thinking of it in capital letters, the warm floor, meant her cabin held heat instead of bleeding it into the frozen earth. She burned half the wood she'd used in previous winters and stayed twice as warm. But the news from the rest of the valley was grim. Old Pete Morrison's cattle were dying, freezing in a barn whose floor had turned to ice. The Hendersons, a young couple in their first winter, were burning through firewood so fast they'd run out by February if something didn't change. Margaret Hutchins had developed frostbite on her feet while sleeping in her own bed, the cold radiating up through the floor despite the fire burning 10 feet away. And then the Hutchins boy lost his toes. Tommy Hutchins was 8 years old, the youngest of Garrett's 3 children. He'd been sleeping in the loft of their cabin, the spot furthest from the stove, but supposedly insulated by rising heat. What no one had accounted for was the cold penetrating from below, the frozen ground, conducting ice into the cabin faster than the stove could fight it. His mother found him at dawn with feet so white they looked like carved soap, frostbitten through 2 pairs of wool socks and a rabbit fur wrap. The doctor rode out from Miller's Crossing and did what he could, but 2 toes on the left foot were beyond saving. An 8-year-old boy maimed inside his own home, while a fire burned in the stove 15 feet away. And at the Calhoun homestead, a widow walked barefoot across her floor every morning without a shiver. Garrett Hutchins appeared at Jesse's door on February 3rd, his son's bandaged feet still fresh in his mind. He didn't come with mockery or condescension. He came with his hat in his hands and something in his eyes that might have been desperation or might have been shame. "Mrs. Calhoun," he said formally, "I'd like to see your floor." Jesse stepped aside without a word and let him enter. Garrett walked to the center of the cabin and stood there, confused by what he felt. The air was warm enough, similar to his own cabin when the stove was burning. But there was something else, a subtle comfort rising from below that he'd never experienced in any Montana home. "Your floor," he said slowly. "It's warm. Not warm, but not frozen either." "That's impossible. The ground is frozen 4 feet deep across the entire valley." "Not here." Jessie knelt and placed her palm flat on the boards. "Feel." Garrett knelt beside her and pressed his own hand against the wood. The temperature was perhaps 45 degrees, cool, but nowhere near the freezing floors he'd grown accustomed to. The floors his son had been sleeping above when his toes turned white. "How?" The word came out rough. "The trench. It creates a thermal break, a wall the cold can't cross. Frost travels through soil by contact. Break the contact, and the cold can't pass. The ground under my cabin never froze because the trench blocked the path." She led him outside, trudging through snow to the edge of the buried trench. She brushed aside the snow cover and dug down through the frozen soil cap until she reached the straw layer beneath. "Feel this." Garrett reached into the hole and touched the straw. It was dry, slightly compressed, and noticeably warmer than the frozen soil surrounding it. Not warm exactly, but insulated. A buffer zone that had resisted the cold penetrating from all sides. "I've been measuring," Jesse said. "Ground temperature outside the trench, 14 degrees. Ground temperature inside the trench, at floor level, 36 degrees. 22 degrees of difference, just from straw in a ditch." Garrett stared at the numbers, at the evidence, at the simple technology that had kept this woman's floor warm while his son lost toes. "The firewood, too," Jesse continued. "I've burned 3 cords since November. You?" 7. The word came out flat. "We're borrowing from Neighbours to make it through February." A frozen floor steals heat. The ground under a cabin takes warmth from the air, from the stove, from everything. You burn wood to warm the air, but the floor eats the warmth faster than you can make it. My floor gives heat back. The ground under my cabin stores warmth during the day and releases it at night. Garrett stood in the snow beside the exposed trench, looking at the simple technology that had saved this woman's comfort, while his son paid the price for his arrogance. "Straw," he said quietly. "Just straw in a ditch. Straw and air. Air stops cold. Simple physics." A long silence stretched between them. "Why didn't you explain this before winter?" Garrett finally asked. "Why didn't you make us understand?" Jesse met his eyes steadily. "I tried. You laughed. Your wife organized delegations to tell me I was a fool. The men at the feed store placed bets on when I'd fail." Garrett had no response. He stood in the snow, the evidence before him, the weight of his mockery pressing down like a physical burden. "Teach me," he finally said. "Please. Before next winter. Before any other children." He couldn't finish the sentence. Jesse looked at him for a long moment. This man who had patronized her for years, who had assumed her grief had broken her mind, who had waited for her to fail with barely concealed anticipation. His son had lost 2 toes because of that arrogance, but his son was 8 years old and had done nothing wrong. "Come back tomorrow," Jesse said. "Bring a shovel. The ground's frozen solid, but we can start cutting through it now. By spring, your trench will be ready to fill." Garrett returned the next day with a shovel and something he'd never offered Jesse before: respect. He started digging through frozen ground in February, chipping away at frost-hardened soil around his own cabin foundation, while his wife watched from the window with exhausted hope. The work was brutal. Each inch of progress cost an hour of labor, but he kept at it, day after day, penance for the months of mockery. Word of Garrett's conversion spread faster than the original ridicule had. The man who'd led the skeptics, who'd declared the widow crazy, who'd wagered money on her failure, that man was now digging his own trench in frozen ground. Something had changed his mind, and the valley wanted to know what. Old Pete Morrison rode over on February 10th and found Garrett knee-deep in a half-completed ditch. "What did you see?" Pete asked. "I felt it." Garrett drove his shovel into the frozen earth. "The floor in Mrs. Calhoun's cabin. It's warm. Not just not cold. Actually, warm. She walks barefoot in the morning. Her horses don't stamp. Her dog sleeps sprawled on the boards without a care." "Impossible." "That's what I said. Then I knelt on her floor and felt it myself." Pete was quiet for a long moment. Then he rode to Jesse's homestead to feel the floor for himself. By March, 4 families had committed to digging trenches around their cabins. Jesse visited each site, offering guidance on depth and width, explaining the importance of dry fill material, warning against common mistakes. She shared her measurements freely, letting the numbers speak louder than her explanations. The spring thaw brought a frenzy of activity. Trenches that had been dug frozen were now ready to fill. Jesse supervised the process at the Hutchins homestead, showing Garrett how to layer straw and leaves, how to test compression, how to cap the fill with soil to protect it from moisture. 3 weeks of labor, Garrett said when the work was complete, looking at the finished trench that surrounded his cabin. "I spent 3 weeks mocking you for wasting time. Could have spent those 3 weeks building my own trench. Now you know. Next winter will be different. My son would still have all his toes if I'd listened." Jesse had no comfort to offer for that. Some lessons came at prices that couldn't be refunded. Some knowledge arrived too late to prevent the damage it could have stopped. "Make sure he teaches his own children someday," she said finally. "Make sure this knowledge doesn't stop with us." By autumn of 1888, every occupied homestead in the valley had thermal trenches around their foundations. The technique spread through word of mouth to neighboring districts, carried by travelers and traders who'd heard the story of the widow and her magical moat. Ranchers from as far as Wyoming rode up to see the trenches for themselves, to feel the warm floors, to learn the simple physics that could save their children's toes. The winter of 1888 to 1889 tested the new construction thoroughly. Temperatures dropped to 42 below in January, colder than anyone could remember. But across the valley, not a single child lost a toe. Not a single family ran out of firewood. The trenches performed exactly as Jesse had promised, creating thermal breaks that kept floors warm and families whole. At the feed store and Miller's Crossing, the betting pool money sat unclaimed. No one wanted to collect winnings that commemorated their own foolishness. Eventually, the $14 went to purchase supplies for a family whose cabin had burned in a chimney fire. Charity to replace mockery. Garrett Hutchins became the technique's most vocal advocate, traveling to settlements across Montana to spread the knowledge he'd once ridiculed. He always told the same story. How he'd laughed at the widow, how his son had paid for his arrogance, how 3 weeks of digging could save a lifetime of regret. 10 years after she dug that first trench, Jessie Calhoun stood on her porch and watched the snow fall over a valley transformed by knowledge she'd almost kept to herself. Smoke had passed 3 winters ago, old and tired, but his son lay at her feet now, a gray dog with the same amber eyes, the same patient attention. The horses in her stable were the grandchildren of the original herd, born on warm floors that never froze. Garrett Hutchins rode up the trail, his breath steaming in the cold air. His son Tommy, now 18, walking with a slight limp from the toes he'd lost, rode beside him. "Mrs. Calhoun," Garrett said, tipping his hat, "the Andersons over in Willow Creek are asking about the trenches. They've got a new baby and they're scared of the floors. I told them you'd explain it better than I could. Jesse nodded. I'll ride over tomorrow. We'll come with you, Tommy said. I like telling people what happens when you don't listen to good ideas. Garrett winced, the old guilt still sharp after a decade. Tommy, Jesse said gently, the point isn't to make people feel bad about what they didn't know. The point is to make sure they know it now. The young man considered this. I suppose, but Pa always says the story works better when I show them my foot. Jesse couldn't argue with that. Some lessons needed to be seen to be believed. Come inside, she said. I've got coffee, and we can plan what to tell the Andersons. They dismounted and followed her into the cabin, into the warmth that rose from the floor like a gift that made the brutal winter outside feel like nothing more than weather to be endured. You know what my grandmother used to say? Jesse asked, pouring coffee into tin cups. She said knowledge isn't like gold. Gold gets smaller when you share it. Knowledge gets bigger. Every person who learns something and teaches it to someone else makes the knowledge stronger. Smart woman, Garrett said. She was. She never saw Montana, never knew I'd use what she taught me to save a whole valley. But her knowledge is here anyway, in every trench, in every warm floor. Jesse handed him his cup. That's what we're really building, you know. Not ditches, not insulation. We're building something that'll outlast all of us. Tommy looked around the cabin, at the simple walls, the crackling fire, the floor that had started a revolution in how people built against the cold. Mrs. Calhoun, he asked, do you ever think about how different things would be if you hadn't dug that first trench? Jesse considered the question. Sometimes, she admitted. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd listened to your father. If I'd decided the old ways were good enough. If I'd given up and accepted frozen floors as just the way things were. What do you think would have happened? I think I'd still be sleeping in my boots. I think Smoke would have lost his paws eventually. She paused, looking at Tommy's feet. I think a lot of children would have lost more than toes. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow continued to fall. But I didn't give up, Jessie said. And now, nobody has to. She raised her coffee cup in a small toast. To warm floors, and to the stubborn women who dig them. Garrett and Tommy raised their cups in return. To warm floors, they echoed. And outside, in the gathering dark, the trenches lay buried beneath the snow. Invisible, essential, a wall against the cold that would protect this valley for generations to come. All because one widow had refused to accept that frozen floors were just the way things had to be.